Right, let's call this session to order. So, welcome everybody. Welcome to this session on open source climate solutions, and welcome to those watching on catch up. So my name is Matt Sandoe. I've got a background in financial risk management, and I'm leading the physical risk and resilience project at OS Climate. OS Climate stands for Open Source Climate, and as you would have seen, today we're a member-driven organisation, and we're very proud to be announcing that we are merging with FINOS, which is going to be a huge value creation for ESG projects around the globe. In addition to this little snapshot on physical climate risk, you're also going to see elements of our data projects presented by Red Hat's Vincent Caldera at about 4:05 this afternoon. So we are all impacted, or we are all going to be impacted by the changes in climate today, whether those are increased droughts, floods, heat waves, rising sea levels. And probably this impacts your day-to-day life and also your working life, potentially even through the risk of supply chain disruption or agricultural failure, water shortage, etc. So why are we really speaking about physical climate risk? Well, the sad reason is that the emission targets set by the globe are failing, and we're failing to meet those targets, which means we have to now prepare to manage the risks that are here today with the changing climate, but also the risks that are coming over time. And these are the human impacts as well as the economic and financial impacts, with potential even for huge systemic failure in the financial system. And obviously our project is spun mostly out of the needs of financial institutions. The sort of risks that I'm talking about, if you think about from a very simple level, would be from a mortgage lender could be lending money on a property that may be underwater in 10, 20 or 30 years' time. Now, we may not be valuing that asset correctly today, but for sure with our ability to look into the future now with improving climate models, it's only a matter of time before this risk manifests itself in valuations today. So there is a huge risk in the system, and that's only thinking about real estate. It doesn't take much to then extend that thought to dramatic agriculture failure or failure in power and other infrastructure systems around the globe. So let's shift on. So not only do I have the pleasure of working with inspirational people in the OS Climate community, such as Michael Tiemann, who you spoke earlier today, I also have the pleasure of copying his slide for those of you that were here this morning. So you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so what we're really trying to do in the OS Climate community is we're trying to first of all measure this risk. Let's understand this risk so that we can look to mitigate it and then ultimately create adaptation finance products. So how can the financial community support adaptation in the communities and for our client base around the globe, which could transfer itself through green bonds, for example, or other risk transfer projects. So OS Climate are working on the sort of core building block layers of measuring this highly complex risk. And the graphic really pictures these building blocks. You can see each side, can't you? Yeah. So really what we're starting to do first of all is we are collaborating with financial firms, consultancies, world-class technology, universities and research institutions. And what we're doing is we're collecting the best open climate models, and we are then producing open source code, which is connecting up the building blocks to the assets and other regions of the world, so we can actually understand who is exposed or when will they be exposed, what assets are exposed, which communities are exposed. And then this little vulnerability building block that you see in the corner there is the indications of these analytics that we use, which show us how vulnerable these particular assets that we're studying. And this requires a whole load of vulnerability data sets. For example, if you think about a power plant, a power plant is going to be much more exposed to a drought or high temperature condition than a warehouse or a headquarters of a company or a software services firm. So ultimately, our aim in the open source community is to create a common language on this topic. We're trying to use collaboration to accelerate what we see is a work that can be performed significantly at a pre-competitive layer, and work that can leverage the research community. So this is a perfect example of a wonderful project that can make a difference around the globe, and suits itself well to open source. So as I said earlier, we're here talking to you today because we are actually really benefiting from a community of practice which is including the technology of, for example, companies like Red Hat. We're working with the likes of IBM Research, right through to consultants, data providers, and commercial service providers that can sit on top of that pre-competitive layer. Now, whilst most of our work is based on that micro scale, for example, how can we collaborate as a bunch of mortgage lenders to understand the risk on a mortgage portfolio today? What you're going to hear from this talk is actually from Richard's going to talk to you about some of the more socio-economic macro perspectives of physical climate risk and how we could use open source to solve and make a difference in this field. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Richard, and over to you.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm Richard Clark. I work at a company called Ortec FINOS, which is based here in London and Rotterdam and elsewhere. We are a financial analytics company looking at the structures of finance and of sovereign bonds and of assets and how to value them. So this is a very well-established process, and what we're bringing to this process now is the climate change aspect. How much will climate change influence those decisions? And in doing this work, we have been able to look at the specific problems that this climate change creates. And in my role as a specialist in acute physical risk, which means extreme weather events and their modeling, I have begun to look at loss and damage. So what is loss and damage? It's the process. Loss and damage is at the center of UN discussions on climate change, the so-called COP, or Coalition of the Parties process, and we have recently had COP28 in Dubai, and COP27 was in Egypt. And at the COP27 meeting, it was agreed to set up a fund to enable funds to be transferred to low and middle income economies where the impacts of climate change are already profound. So this loss and damage sits at the intersection of mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation are the processes we're trying to install through mainly engineering processes to reduce carbon emissions, and adaptation is a myriad of processes trying to deal with the consequences of climate change. And loss is one component of this. Loss is the permanent loss of resources and biodiversity and infrastructure, and indeed culture. And a good example of this in the United States was the case where Youth versus Montana, what they went to court about, these 20 youths, was that climate change and the impacts of fossil fuel extraction were impacting their right to a healthful life through smoke, through heat, through drought, through biodiversity loss, and so on. And that impacted in turn on their culture and life and development and health. Damage is more measurable. It's the extent to which climate change is already impacting extreme weather events and heat events, as we see, and the agreement was put in place at COP28 to operationalize this process, and it's proven to be a very challenging discussion. And even in last week, The Week reported that the Bonn climate talks leave much to do at COP29. So we see, on the one hand, negotiations continuing, but also the impacts of climate change are already very evident around the world. So, for example, in the spring, in the southern part of Brazil, at Porto Alegre, for example, we saw that climate change was playing a part in this. This has been determined through world weather attribution studies, that climate change increased the odds of this happening by a factor of 2, and the El Nino phenomenon also had an impact. But also infrastructure, dams and flooding infrastructure was not at the level it should have been or maintained at the level it should have been, so this too had an impact on the consequences. In Mozambique last year, we had the strongest cyclone we'd seen on record, and this went into landfall 3 times, killing thousands in Malawi and also in Madagascar, creating havoc. And in the small island states around the Pacific, we're seeing the impacts of sea level rise and climate change already causing population movement. And right now in Nepal, we're seeing forest fires that are partly attributable to climate change, but there's also different approaches to forest management as the economy grows. So it's a very complex problem. So one of the things we think is important in our proposal is to estimate to what extent climate change is affecting loss and damage at thousands of locations around the world. And then once we have that information, determine the criteria of who could contribute and receive from the fund and how best to use the arising information. So we're bringing physical risk modeling to the question of how to deal with the loss and damage question. And in the methodology, we talk about having a mechanism that is fair across all countries and all nations, and determine a real-time economic vulnerability ratio. I'll say more about that in a moment. And that there should be a funding balance overall. What is paid into the fund should be also what is needed from the fund. And the data and models need to be very transparent. If we're talking about negotiations where there are funds transfer, then people will want to see the code and they will want to see the data that lies behind it. And finally, granularity matters. It's not sufficient to say that one city has a problem. We want to know which street and which suburb has a problem and why. So the culmination of this work was a Nature comment piece last November, in which Matt also contributed, and Noah Westcombe, and we were very honoured to have the late Professor Salim Ul-Hook and his colleague Mizan Khan join the authorship and contribute. And Professor Salim Ul-Hook was one of the leading lights in developing the loss and damage question and was probably instrumental in getting it agreed at COP27. And what we've tried to do in this paper is to set out the argument for the model that I just described and to give some illustration of the consequences of climate change on cities today and how that might go forward under the current warming that we have. So if we look at the cities at risk diagram, there are about 5 cities here, and they all have very different characteristics. So if we take, for example, the city of London, where we are today, then we have a long-established city that's wealthy and has a lot of adaptation and resilience. And yet, even within London, there are vulnerabilities like flooding in low-lying areas and also from fire. And we had a very stark incidence of that not so long ago. As we move out, if we look at Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, in Bangladesh there's been huge efforts at adaptation, both in cities but also in agriculture and in sea level rise protection and typhoon protection as well. And because of that, the cities in Dakar has been able to improve its likely outcome in terms of the economic impacts of climate change. So what we see in the diagram on the left is this economic vulnerability ratio. That's to say the proportion of a city's GDP that's eaten, as it were, by climate change divided by the city's GDP. So we're thinking in terms of 0.1% being a tolerable level. London has a figure like that. But at 1%, that's really going to impact economic development. And so for most of the countries, most of the cities there, we've had fairly level growth of this risk, partly because of population movements, partly because of weather and temperature. In Hangzhou, China, for example, because of the rapid economic development, their risk has come down substantially over the last 25 years. And yet, for all these cities, we're seeing the danger of them now rising up in risk again because of the effects of climate change. And we can see that adaptation can be done in very many ways. This is an example of floating farms in Bangladesh. And looking to the world map, we see, of course, that sub-Saharan Africa is profoundly affected in terms of this economic vulnerability ratio, and Nepal and the Stans, and in Central America, and indeed in the US Midwest as well. This is one of the key outcomes of the work that we've done so far, to address the question of how much loss and damage funding needing is there. And the question, the answer is profound. It's hundreds of billions of dollars a year, every year, and it's growing. And we're not alone in saying that. And yet, what's already been pledged to the pot for this funding is about $700 million. That's 0.2% of the requirement. So what do others think about the levels of funding? So a recent paper suggested that it's about $400 billion, but there's a lot of uncertainty to this. And another study a few years ago showed that in 2030, it could be of the order of $400 billion a year. And what we're saying is this need is comprised not only of extreme weather events, but also the chronic heat events that we've been reading about so much recently. That's to say, what is the effect of increasing temperatures on productivity, on health and development? And Professor Esther Duflo, who's the Professor of Economics Development at MIT, recently gave a keynote speech here in London at which she said, I think that we need to find $518 billion, and she thinks she knows how to do it. One is to approach through various mechanisms the 3,000 billionaires that now exist, and the other is to look at corporation tax. But it's very, very challenging space. And if we look at Elon Musk's package, for example, we see, okay, there's 45 billion. That's about 1/3 of the extreme weather risk. But the requirements are much larger than this. And by 2050, we could be looking at trillions of dollars of requirement. So how can the open source community contribute to this? How can I encourage you to get involved in this? So what I've done here is to take some of the essences of the Ortec finance model, the climate predict model, and say, what is it that is contributing to this risk? And apart from climate change, urbanization, that's to say population movement, is very, very critical. And the more granular we can know that, the better. The second derivative of that movement, the rate of change, has implications for loss. So we can correlate those two things, because people will not leave their homes unless they absolutely have to. And if they never return, you can be sure that there's a large loss associated with that. Event attribution, that's to say, what extent is climate change impacting these events, and how is that amplifying the losses, is key. And very granular temperature predictions both of historic and future scenarios is very key as well. Economic data, particularly GDP per capita, as localized as possible, and other factors such as the history of recent extreme weather events. If you have cascading events, then you have more than twice the loss that creates, and other weather phenomena such as El Nino, volcanic eruptions, and so on. The models that we have so far are fairly primitive, but they are a start. They set the scene. We think we're capturing the essence of what is driving these effects, both economically and socially. And what I would suggest here is that there is now new and exciting open source literature. So, for example, the paper on chronic physical risk by Kotz, Lieberman, and Wentz that was recently published, and some very interesting work at MIT on downscaling the global circulation models using AI and machine learning. So it's all very exciting, and I think these models now can help inform. But thinking of Matt's original diagram, it's also the other factors, the human factors of risk and population, because to get an event, a disaster, you have to have the intersection of extreme weather and humanity. So while these negotiations continue, what else could we think about doing with the information that these physical risk models create? And one suggestion has been that we can use that data of how much capacity some cities have and how much capacity other cities need, to marry these together to create a kind of twinning arrangement where, for example, you'd have a city like London that could be twinned with, say, these 3 cities in India and a city in China. So they use up that spare capacity that London has and create a dynamic relationship. So, for example, to exchange expertise, technology, culture, governance, inclusivity, preparedness, and adaptation, all on loss and damage. And this is a two-way street because cities can learn from each other. Now, of course, there are communities like C40 where a lot of this work goes on already. But what I'm suggesting here is there are opportunities to find new relationships between cities based upon their physical risk and loss and damage needs. So a country would look after its own cities to begin with, but where it has excess capacity, to think of sharing this. No money is transferred, it's all about knowledge and expertise and culture that is exchanged. And as I say, this could be something that is going on in parallel with the negotiations to figure out how to operationalize the loss and damage funding. So we think this is a very exciting area. We're looking for collaboration, and clearly there is new data and new knowledge emerging all the time. And I think we can say that the question of climate impacts is already exploding and is likely to get worse before it gets better. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah. So before we open up the floor to any questions, because we're going to have a couple of minutes, I just wanted to reiterate part of the messages that you would have heard earlier today, that this is great news that we're merging with FINOS. It's going to massively expand our member and potential contributor base. So please, as Jane said this morning, please take this information back to your member companies or contributor companies. Not only is it a very highly relevant topic, it also will make a difference inside organizations because, for example, your typical financial institution is not going to have the technological capability to handle geospatial files, to rapidly onboard them, process them, structure them, convert them into something that tells them a financial measure or a decision-ready measure. The benefit as well of creating a common language amongst a community of practice, bringing in the best from the universities and research institutions and creating a plug-and-play capability where that can be combined with commercial commercial software as well and commercial data, will open up that black box as much as possible and help solve the long-term needs that institutions have. And obviously these subjects that we're talking about, because we're touching on data expertise, which Vincent will speak about at 4 o'clock today, these are also highly relevant to the unspoken potential catastrophic area of biodiversity. And when you combine the biodiversity and climate topic together, this is going to be another extremely highly relevant, explosive subject for the future. So that's all from us. Perhaps we can open up to a question, if that's okay, from the Compare team.
Just a question: will we be able to get together with you after this session, either at the OS Climate booth or at the Improvements Reserve Plaza 3 to talk about this?
Great, yeah, thank you for the loaded question from Truman there. Yeah, he reminded me that I forgot to tell you, of course, that we are going to be around at the booth and speaking again here later on today, and in the executive suite for where we can set up any potential meetings. And you've got all the QR codes from the previous presentations, and in the appendix of these slides, which will be available for distribution, you will have the links to all of our mail distribution and GitHubs for the physical risk environment. Suite 3, yeah, we'll be in Suite 3. Great, I think. Okay, I guess we've answered everything then, Richard. So, so thanks very much, everyone, and we save 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you.